Well, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. We are going to talk about accessing grade level content tonight with our assistive technology. And you will probably notice that if you read everything, that it was not supposed to be Jennifer and I who are presenting tonight. So we're just pitch hinting tonight. So hopefully all will work out. So just a little bit about myself, if you don't know who I am. My name is Kathy White. I am one of the co-chairs for Assistive Technology Forward Grant. I was a classroom teacher. I also spent 33 years in the same school district, which is kind of unheard of. I led and created our school district assistive technology team. I presented at a lot of state and national conferences. I've taught at higher ed, and now I'm doing this. It's a weird thing when you retire.
We just brought back a retired person to help us out in AT. You retired people are invaluable to me. I don't know.
Thanks.
So my name is Jennifer Schubring. I am a speech language pathologist with an expertise in augmentative and alternative communication and assistive technology. I work in the Green Bay area public schools as an AT program support staff, and I began learning about AAC 20 years ago. I have a private practice building AAC, and I live in the Green Bay area.
So our learning objectives tonight are kind of, we want this to be an open conversation tonight. We want participants to identify like what technology might benefit students in the reg ed setting. So we're going to talk about a lot of technology in the areas of math and science, but also in art and music. So we just want to make sure that all kids are included in everything. So, and we're going to explore a variety of assistive tech that you might find in these unique areas. And we really want to explore and kind of talk about what your beliefs are on inclusion, because everybody has kind of a different outlook, I guess is the best way to put that, on what really is inclusion. So we kind of want to start out. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. You can take it.
I just was going to start out just by this is a quote from Temple Grandin, and I guess the best way to explain Temple, if you don't know who she is, if you ever get a chance to go see her in person, you got to go. She is an adult who has a significant autism, and she has really taught the world there are lots of ways to look at things. You know, wouldn't you agree, you know, Jennifer, there's just a different, she's taught us to look at things through a different lens. And I love this quote. You know, there needs to be a lot more emphasis on what a child can do instead of what they can't do. And I think if we keep that in mind tonight as we go through this, and it's one of those things too, like Jennifer was saying before about taking things to IEP meetings, you can take this thought when you go to your IEP meeting. You know, parents know what their kid can't do. And it's kind of a constant thing I think we need to think about when we're in IEP meetings. We always think about, oh, they can't do this, they can't do that. You know what? Tell parents what the kids can do. Let's think about all of those awesome things that they offer to the class, not what they necessarily can't do, because they probably do know that fact.
And this is a quote that I put in all of my presentations because I think it's just so important. And, you know, just in reference to IEPs, like when we're talking about students' strengths during their IEP, that's one of my favorite pieces of the IEP. And even asking the student, what are your strengths? What are you good at? And building off of those.
Absolutely. And then I really like this one too. And again, remember, this is a direct quote from Temple. So the autistic mind is constantly learning. I have an internet inside my brain, and the more experiences and memories I have, the more web pages I have to search. That's why it's so crucial to expose autistic kids to lots of interesting things, even if they're afraid. You know, all of us have gone through these kind of things when we've gone into a new situation that we're like, oh, very tentative or very frightened about whatever. You know, but their experiences, and that's where we learn. You know, if we keep kids segregated in their own, in little boxes all the time, we don't learn anything. You know, we all need to get out there and explore.
And I think this is so important. And that's why, you know, I really love inclusion. And I always talk about this in terms of AAC and augmentative alternative communication, and that, you know, our kids often don't have the same experiences as their regular ed peers. And so even when we're talking about vocabulary and modeling that on a communication device, you know, we have to be really cognizant of, you know, what have they been exposed to? I worked with an individual who lived in sort of a skilled nursing facility, and there was, they were talking about roller coasters and like the physics of roller coasters. Well, this child had never been on a roller coaster. She'd never seen one. She basically just lived in the skilled nursing facility and really only got out for medical appointments. And so we watched, you know, just brought up some YouTube videos of people riding roller coasters with a GoPro on. So that was sort of that point of view where they felt like you were going on a roller coaster. And really, you know, again, we need to continually expose them in a variety of different ways. Even, you know, doing that through YouTube videos is really important, but exposing kids in that regular ed setting to the curriculum too is really important.
We just don't ever know sometimes what kids don't have experiences with, things that we would normally think like, oh, you got to be kidding me. I had a student a few years ago who he had never had a salad as a middle schooler, never eaten a salad because his mother had a disability. She always cooked in the microwave. She never cooked on the stove. They rarely had anything fresh in their house. And I thought, wow, you know, I never would have thought that a middle schooler had never had a salad. So made sure he got a salad.
Do we still want to do this, Kathy?
You betcha.
Okay, so using the annotation tools on Zoom, you can find them up in your toolbar. There's a little pencil that says annotate. Take a minute, or even if you just feel like throwing it in the chat, you can do that. What are some words that come to mind when you think of inclusion?
We just want to get everyone kind of thinking tonight. So like one of the big things that I think about when I think about inclusion is the word empathy. And again, it's that exposure thing. If you have never seen someone who has a significant physical disability, how do you know how to react to them? You know, I always thought, people always thought it was funny in my classroom. I had students with very significant needs, and people used to say that I could have a conversation with someone who was nonverbal for hours. And I said, yeah, sure, why not? Because, you know, it's just once you start experiencing those, we've got a few coming in: access, belonging, community. I love it. Collaboration, beautiful. Thanks for joining in on us. We do appreciate that.
Clear this.
That's okay.
There we go.
Yeah. So just kind of think about that, because like between like what Jennifer said and what I said is that there's always something different on what we think is inclusion. You know, when you look at inclusion rates, which is kind of what we're going to talk about right now, is that it's very different in people's eyes. And even when you go and look at like the WISE dash data and stuff like that, I never realized what the difference was. Like the inclusion rate, does anybody have any idea what the inclusion rate is now in the whole US for students with disabilities? It's actually in the 60s.
Do you know how they define inclusion rate? Is that like, because sometimes I feel like for inclusion, you know, they go for one class period and we're including them with their peers, or is that the inclusion rate that they're like with peers all day long?
Most of them have to do like with 80%. So like when I checked with the Janesville Public Schools, just out of curiosity a few weeks ago, I said, what is the inclusion rate right now? In 75, we are above the national average in Janesville, which I think is awesome. 75% with type of are included 80% of the time or more in reg ed classes.
Okay. So they define it as a percentage of time that they're in that classroom in that regular ed setting. Interesting.
I just think it's really important that we kind of know this and access this information, because when you sit down and you're discussing things with parents or team members, thinking about, what is the inclusion rate? Where are our opportunities to include kids? If you never have a classroom where you don't have any students who are verbal, how is that student supposed to learn to become verbal, because they have no models? So it's just very important for you to kind of think about this. Does anybody else know their inclusion rates, by the way? Something you guys might want to look up. Ask your directors of special ed, just out of curiosity. They can get the information off of the WISE Dash, and you'll be able to see what that is. And I think, again, it's very important for us to know when we go into meetings and when we're talking to parents about what the inclusion is, so we have an idea on where and what's important. These are just some other words that you might want to think about. I always think that these are nice to take a look at times, although I'll be very honest, with someone with a learning disability, this is tough for me to read at times. But there are a few that I can read. I think that fun and knowledge are very important. The communication, and we had kind of hit a few of these, but we didn't talk about something like rigor, and holding kids to higher expectations. It's amazing. Oh yeah, and it's hard for VI persons too. Thanks, Amy. Yeah, this is really tough for me, because anything that's not going in the right direction is hard, and then things that are in red, I don't read very well either. So yeah.
What's interesting is that right down here we have below culture, we have optimism, rigor, but there's a smaller word here. And if I turn my head, it looks like the word lazy, which is interesting that lazy would be next to optimism and rigor.
It is interesting. And I really think that this is so important, that when we start to put students in reg ed settings, that we need to really think about there should be no stigma for them using any type of technology. And I think this is worth a little bit of a conversation here. I think kids are under a lot of stress to begin with. And you put a student who has a visual or hearing or physical or an OGCOM situation, and they're in a regular class and they're already a little heightened as it is. And then we're going to give them like humongous technology or technology that just doesn't fit in. So we really need to think about that too. How are we making sure that it's a little less stressful for them? We don't want kids to stand out.
And I think exactly what you said, and again, with my perspective, maybe a little bit more on the AAC end, or students that have complex communication needs, we deal with this all the time. They don't want to use, especially when they get older, they don't want to use those communication devices because they don't want to look different from their peers. And it's nice that technology has sort of evolved and we're using more off-the-shelf technology. I have a student right now where we had him on an iPad mini because of some motor issues, and has some pretty significant behaviors, and ended up at an alternative placement for a little bit. And so we're focusing on that communication, and we got an iPhone type size device, because that he can, and if he can handle it motorically, that he can put in his pocket. He can look just like his peers. And it had even some like hanging strap things. And I asked the vendor, can we take those off? Because he isn't going to want to look any different from his peers. But it's important to remember when we're looking and we're feature matching that we're making those considerations for students, because they don't want to look different in using this technology. So that was the nice piece about virtual. People didn't know what other students were using, and we probably saw a little bit more buy-in and increase because they were at home. Nobody could tell that they were utilizing those tools, which was interesting. But now we got to sort of bridge that back into the classroom.
There was a really interesting research study did a few years ago about people who were in New York City who had some mental health issues. And they were trying to get others who were in the streets too to stop those negative interactions, because people who have different mental health may be talking to themselves all the time, and then people didn't know how to react to them, and they were having too many clashes and then having to call police and this and that. And the interesting thing that they did, I thought this was so cool anyway, is they provided dead cell phones and earpieces to the people who had significant mental health issues. And because they had the earpiece, people were like, just talking on the phone. Or if they had that phone up to them, they figured they were talking to somebody else. And it changed the perception. It changed how they saw them. And then there were less conflicts. It was
Wow.
just an amazing little piece.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So let's look at, speaking of research, let's look at a couple other pieces of research. This was a thing I read the other day, a study of over 1,000 teachers. And one of them talked about, and I did mention them in here so you can go back and read the whole article if you want, but 67% of educators indicated that there was improved access to the curriculum when they used assistive tech. And they had increased, and the things they were looking at were increased access to technology or to text, ways to respond, which I think is very important when we're talking about universal design. Again, how do we respond back and forth? Access to auditory kind of things, information, captioning, description, video, and universal design for learning. So these are the things that teachers felt were very necessary for us to be having classrooms that worked well for all kids. And then they had a little thing on the side here that I do think is very important to think about too, is that unlike assistive technology, which is usually like a one-to-one kind of a thing, that we really need to think about instructional technology supports, because again, that's going to help with that stigma piece, and that's going to help everyone use the tools. You know, I'm a huge, firm believer in that everyone needs to model what they're using. If you've got kids who have AUGCOM devices in the classroom, there should be other ones in there for people who are verbal, so that you can have that exchange and people are more on an even level and they're like, oh, this is how other people talk too, and that's okay. You know, so we need those models for sure. This was actually sent to me by Ruth, from the president of Don Johnston. She sent me this the other day. She did a presentation at ATIA in Florida. And I found this extremely, incredibly, in some ways disheartening, that this was a snapshot in 2016. So it is a few years old, but not too much when you think about it, on a parent educator report of use of assistive technology. And if you look way down on the bottom there, and I know this is a really bad screenshot, and I apologize to anyone who can't read this because it's difficult even for me to read, but down on the bottom it says 7%. So in 2016, only 7% of our kids with disabilities were using assistive technology. And I wonder if it was because how it was defined or how people perceived it. Because again, like that instructional piece, like, was it instructional technology and they didn't see it as unique or geared towards someone who needed something very specific, or what the deal was? So I just kind of wanted to throw that in there because, you know, when you think about it, the laws and stuff around assistive tech have been around a very long time now. So we really need to make sure that when we're looking at things like inclusion rates and things like that, or the use of assistive tech, that we know what the definition is. How did we define where we're getting at?
What's interesting,
So,
Kathy, when you look at the numbers, like, so there's categories on the bottom, and it sort of defines those. And the one on the bottom, just below total, that says DB is deaf blind. And then the one above that is hearing impairment. And the one above that is visual impairment. And those categories seem to be a little bit higher, like deaf blind is 73.2%, visual impairment is 62.3%. So those disability areas that are a little bit more visual, you can see them, versus, you know, something like ADHD or a learning disability that are more of those invisible disabilities. You may not really, you know, they don't stand out. You don't have hearing aids in or whatever. You're not using, you know, glasses for that visual impairment. You know, those numbers are a lot lower compared to more of those disability areas like visual impairment and deaf blind that are a little bit more you can see those disabilities.
Yeah,
Not
those are
always,
but when you look at the numbers, they're smaller.
Mhm.
Yep. And it's interesting because it still went down.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Well, and look at learning disability. It's 5.2. 5.2%. Really? That's a high incidence population.
That's nuts.
But only 5.2% of them are using assistive tech.
But again, like you
Wow.
said, Kathy, like, are they voice texting? Maybe they're
Yep.
not great spellers, but do they see that more as not necessarily an assistive technology? That's just technology these days. So it's interesting. How is it defined?
Yep. I think
Go
that,
ahead, Amy.
yeah, I'm sorry. I think it's because they're using more of the integrated technology and people are looking at these as specialized devices, I wonder.
It could very well be. I haven't been able to find the exact study. She sent me the slide and I was just like floored. I'm like 7%. So it's just something to really kind of think about. So based on that, what are examples of technology that, that you think makes inclusion easier? Because I think that we need to think about what is inclusion, what is instructional technology, and what is assistive technology, and knowing how all those things meet. So again, if you want to annotate or share, throw it in the chat. Learning resources such as, Brain Pop. Awesome. Yep, that would be a good one. That's a good inclusionary one.
A lot of I feel like we increased these areas when we went virtual. Like we have access to like Bookflix or Epic Books or Brain Pop, like all of those tools where they had a lot of built-in supports that could read the text.
Yeah, and we had a couple in the chat come in, speech to text, text to speech. Absolutely. Flipgrid.
Yeah, Flipgrid.
Yep,
Mhm.
that's a good one. Yeah. And again, that's that UDL piece. Again, the kids are doing it, universal design for learning. Absolutely.
And more of the tech companies are coming out and making a bigger splash or a bigger deal about the accessibility features and making a point of saying, well, just because they're accessibility features doesn't mean that everybody can't use them. So I feel like that is a huge deal too.
Absolutely. You're so right, Amy.